So today we're going to be taking a look at a hypothetical war scenario where the United States and Brazil go to war. Now in real life, the United States and Brazil, they aren't necessarily allies, but they are strategic partners. The relationship kind of goes up and down depending on what's happening in the world, but the US does consider Brazil a non-NATO major ally, so an actual war between these two is definitely not likely. But hypothetically, what if it happened? It is likely that we would see other countries get involved since these are both major powers. Brazil more so of a regional power, but still one of the strongest ones in the world. But if you guys do enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you're new. We just hit 200,000 subscribers, and if you haven't seen the 200k video that was posted last Monday, highly recommend go watching it. In fact, I encourage you to go watch it to see what we're doing for that celebration. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump straight into this video. Now, how exactly would a hypothetical war between these two start? Let's just say that the United States had boats off the coast of Venezuela. We know that the US and Venezuela are enemies, and currently the US is blowing up narcotic boats off the coast of Venezuela. But let's say that Brazil sends some naval ships up there to monitor the situation, and US boats and Brazilian boats got into an exchange. They fired on each other, and one thing leads to another, and the two countries end up going to war. This is a non-NATO war, so Article 5 of NATO would not be activated, meaning that all of the European countries in NATO would not get involved. But like I was saying, both of these countries do have allies, and some of those countries would get involved. It does kind of depend on the situation though, and who the aggressor is. But for the sake of this video, let's say that it was kind of a mutual thing. Both boats fired on each other pretty much simultaneously, and there was no true aggressor. We're also going to make the assumption that recently strained relations are not into effect, so Canada will join this war, and the whole thing they have with the US right now, that's going to be ignored. Additionally, joining the US's team are the countries of France and the United Kingdom, and these are kind of like your core US allies. These countries typically stay with the US no matter what and have joined them in various wars throughout history, but these are like the US's core allies in the Northern Atlantic. As for Brazil, it's a little bit more complicated. They don't really have any formal military alliances with any other nations, but they do have strategic partnerships with some. So Peru joins the war on the side of Brazil, and so does Uruguay. Now, a lot of the countries in between these two are pretty split between who they favor. Like Colombia, for example, has good relations with the US, but they also have pretty good relations with Brazil. Same thing with Guyana, although that's more situational because of the whole Venezuela thing, but they also align with Brazil and also a little bit with the US. But the first bit of fighting will be taking place down here in French Guiana, because remember, France did join the war, so Brazilian troops will quickly enter into this overseas territory, and they will also very quickly seize it, as not a lot of military assets are here defending it. Now, the British and the French will be sending their troops over here, probably to like Puerto Rico as a staging ground, and same thing with the main US force and Canadian forces, so they will all be meeting up in Puerto Rico. And on the topic of Puerto Rico, we're going to go ahead and say that the US is going to achieve naval dominance in this region because the US Navy is miles ahead of the Brazilian Navy. Not to say that Brazil doesn't have a decent or good Navy, but it's just that, the US Navy is freaking amazing. When I say amazing, I mean that in a non-biased way. The US Navy is quite literally the strongest Navy in the world, and it is stronger by a good portion. Now, China does have more vessels, but quantity doesn't always equal quality. So in that regard, the US does still have the most dominant Navy in the world. Now, countries like Russia and China would likely take the side of Brazil because this is a common enemy that Russia and China both share. And now that they're going up against a country like Brazil, it makes it even easier for American enemies to align with Brazil, and thus they will likely be sending aid and resources over to these countries, although they will not be getting directly involved because that would start a world war, and that's not what we're trying to do here. So US naval boats will be bombarding the coast of Brazil, targeting key military infrastructure in order to set up grounds for an amphibious invasion. Now, Brazil is a huge country, and invading it would take a very long time, not to mention their geography and also like the Amazon rainforest. That does make it extremely difficult to invade, but we also do have to know that Brazil will not be able to go on offense against the US. The US is pretty much untouchable at this point, unless Brazil gets a new ally. Mexico joins the war on the side of Brazil, and Mexico is a country that shares kind of warm relations with the US, although they have been strained recently, and then they also hold pretty good relations with Brazil because of that Latin American connection. Mexico and Brazil are the two biggest economies in Latin America, and thus they are economic partners. Now, Mexico probably would never join a war against the US because they would get folded, but just for the case of this hypothetical situation, they will. So with Mexico in the war, they will attempt to send some troops over into the Americas, and they will have success in the southern Texas region, as well as taking over the major city of El Paso. Now, Mexico would have very limited military success at first because the US likely would not allow this to happen. In fact, the moment that Mexico declares war, a bunch of US troops would immediately be on the border. So these little incursions into the US are very short-lived, as American forces push the Mexicans right back out. An emphasis would be placed on protecting the Southern California area, as there are a ton of people here, and people equal money and economics, so you want to protect this at all costs. So the first American invasion force moves in to western Mexico. Additionally, we see some small incursions here and there throughout the border, mostly in the Texas region as well, because this is an optimal area to invade into, especially considering the Gulf of Mexico and getting this coastal land right here. So US forces will make a push over here to the major city of Monterrey. I might be pronouncing that wrong, apologies if I am. But a modern day US invasion of Mexico would definitely not go so well for Mexico. Now, they're not like a pushover country, they are a medium tier country in terms of power, but Brazil is likely unable to send any kind of aid up to Mexico due to the US Navy's dominance in this area. So really, it's Mexico versus the US, Canada, the UK, and France without any help. That is a recipe for disaster, as American troops will quickly move over and capture the major city of Chihuahua. We would also see American forces pretty quickly go ahead and capture all of Baja California and use that as an advantage to move further down the western Mexican coast. Now, the geography of Mexico is pretty stern. You know, there's a huge mountain range that goes throughout pretty much the entire country, or the entirety of this part of the country. It doesn't really clear up until you get down here, but this is more of a tropical area, and with tropics you get rainforest, and rainforests are not fun to invade. America knows that, especially. But moving in the slightly less mountainous western region of Mexico, American troops will quickly move down the coast with very little resistance. Any kind of counter invasion by the Mexicans would be very short-lived, and eventually we have the Red Team forces pushing right back. We would also see American troops land in the Yucatan Peninsula and take over the major city of Merida. Now, this is the more tropical area of Mexico, so there would be a little bit of an issue doing this. They'd likely just stick to the coastal areas until they can move into this thinner part and cut off this section from the rest of Mexico, which would eventually make it surrender. Guerrilla warfare would definitely be prominent there. But anytime a country is being invaded by outside powers, there's going to be guerrilla warfare. So that's not just happening here. It's probably happening everywhere else, especially in the occupied territories. Now, as you notice, there was a naval landing right here next to Mexico City, and that's because this is where the main invasion force is going to be. Mexico City is an extremely populated city, and the US and friends are going to need as many forces as they can get to take over the city. So when they start getting closer, it gets a lot harder to move forward. The major city of Puebla would definitely be a priority of the Red Team, and after capturing that, Mexico City would be a lot easier to go ahead and try to occupy. Notice how I say try, because once again, it's an extremely populated city, and Mexico would try to defend it with everything they've got. At this point, it has been encircled though, and the Red Team troops will slowly but surely make their way in, probably doing some not so great things to the people there, including starvation, because that's what war people do sometimes. Yeah, war people, that makes sense. But for the sake of the scenario, they will eventually capture Mexico City and break over here to the Pacific coast, cutting Mexico into two large pieces. Now, this is where the geographically challenged area is, so going through here isn't a priority, but what is a priority is capturing this major city here. Forces will eventually take over this city, Guadalajara, and with that, Mexico is left without any other major cities, so invading through the rest of this country would be pretty quick and pretty, well, not easy, but definitely a lot faster than the original invasion, and ultimately they would surrender. With Mexico out of the war, the focus now shifts right back to South America, and some countries are going to decide to take some sides here. More so, Colombia will join the war on the side of the United States, because behind closed doors they were given a pretty good deal, and that deal includes land as well as some other economic incentives, so the Colombian government is kind of bribed, I don't want to say bribed, but they're persuaded into joining the war against Brazil, and this is going to have some effects on the rest of the continent, because at this point it looks like the US is going to have a very easy way into Brazil and Peru, and some countries in South America don't like the fact that American imperialism has seemed to return. And I'm looking at Argentina specifically. Now, Brazilian and Argentinian relations are currently strained, and Argentina's relations with the US have been pretty good because the two leaders of these countries are pretty similar, but kind of assuming a little bit that Argentina is going to prioritize the continent over relations with America, we have Argentina joining the war on the side of Brazil. Once again, relations between these two countries have been pretty up and down, but there is finally a common cause, and that's why we see them join the war. Now, other countries could definitely get involved, like Bolivia, for example, but for now, they might just sit it out and allow this to happen. Anyway, back up north, with Colombia joining the war, it actually doesn't really go as planned, as Peruvian and Brazilian forces will quickly move into the country, as they maybe might have gotten leaked the deal that Colombia made. Maybe someone chirped. But with blue team forces quickly moving into Colombia, the US and its allies will have to act fast in order to save Colombia from the rest of the blue team, which at this point is a lot stronger than Colombia itself, so they are in danger of getting rolled over. So US forces will kind of be split off from Puerto Rico. They have to kind of avert their naval landing plan, and instead they'll send some forces into Colombia to save them. They are not, however, going to give up the plan to amphibiously invade Brazil starting in French Guiana, and preparations for that will commence. But now, taking a quick break, I want to address something. I fixed my camera. Well, I didn't fix it per se, but more so I tweaked the settings on it, and I think the quality is like 100 times better now. Do you guys agree? It was first noticeable in the 200K video. Once again, if you haven't seen the 200K video, go watch it because it's really important for the channel, and you know, who doesn't want to celebrate 200K, right? There was an icon up there at the beginning of the video. Go click that, watch that video. But yeah, it turns out that like the frame rate on the camera was low, and it's a 60 FPS camera and it wasn't running at 60 FPS. So I switched it and now it is. So everything's a little bit smoother. Also tweaked the colors a little bit and tweaked the sharpness so it shouldn't be as fuzzy as it used to be. Overall, I think it looks a lot better. Let me know what you think in the comments. But red team forces will finally arrive in Colombia and they will begin to push back the invading Brazilians and Peruvians. Although they do make it known that it is not a priority to take back all this lost land. It's not super valuable, and them holding on to it isn't going to like do a lot of damage to Colombia. And Colombia, I mean, they definitely probably want their land back, but they're going to go along with the US's plan and help out in the amphibious invasion. Now, I don't know how much they're going to help out because they do have to hold this defensive line down here, but they could definitely aid some like logistical help over to the red team. But now the time is finally here, and the red team will be making an amphibious landing near the capital city of French Guiana. It is a very treacherous landing as Brazilians had fortified the coastal areas, and the red team loses a lot of troops in this invasion. It is successful though, and they're able to establish a foothold in South America, which will be very huge later on as they will try to attempt to invade the rest of Brazil. Although once again, that is going to be a very tall task, so we're going to have to see how it happens. Eventually, they'll be able to take back the capital city of French Guiana, and they're not going to fully liberate this country because this area up here isn't like super valuable. In fact, it's not super valuable until you get over here to like where these major cities are, and then randomly this one in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, Manaus. But the priority at this point is definitely this city over here, Belém, I think. So red team forces that are led by the Americans will begin to move down the coastal area of Brazil. Once again, this is some pretty hectic fighting, but they are able to secure this coastal area using the entrance to the Amazon to their advantage. Now, speaking of the Amazon, we're going to go ahead and enable the river layer for the rest of this war because rivers are pretty important when you're considering the invasion of Brazil. But once they have established this control, they'll go ahead and liberate the rest of French Guiana, and it will start to move inland just slightly in order to push up against this river here, which they are able to successfully do. They are experiencing a lot of resistance, but Brazilian forces will eventually fall back to the other side of the river, and this little front line right here will be stalemated. Now, from here it gets a little bit complicated because what does the US and their allies want to do? They have established this foothold in Brazil, but there's still a lot of land to go. Additionally, there could be an advantage to taking out a country like Peru, but the main target of this war is once again Brazil. So the Americans will make the decision to go ahead and secure the entrance to the Amazon River. They're going to go after this entire delta area over here. Similar to the amphibious landing, this is a very, very fought for area. The forces are able to eventually secure the entrance. And from here, another naval landing is made, this time over here on this little tip of the coast. And the main focus of this landing is to capture this major city here, which is what they do. From here, American forces will move over until they eventually meet this river here, and they will establish a solid front line across the south right here, and that is where their invasion will stop for now. The foothold in Brazil is holding, and there is an influx of South American troops coming up to this, but there's also an influx of Canadian, British, and French forces coming over here as well. The US could try to consult other countries into joining the war in South America, promising them similar deals to what they promised Colombia, but it's unlikely that we would see anyone else join because look at the geographical situation here. If Chile joined, they would get stomped by Argentina. If Bolivia joined, well, Bolivia, don't join. I'm just going to say that. Definitely don't join Paraguay. That would be horrible. There is like Ecuador, but Ecuador is a pretty neutral country. They definitely wouldn't get involved. They have no interest either way. And then Venezuela hates both sides, so Venezuela is just going to sit here and watch. Suriname, I don't know anything about the relations of Suriname. Trinidad and Tobago joins the war. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. That would be way too powerful for the red team. Anyway, the US Navy is still dominating the Brazilian Navy in this mid-Atlantic region, so more plans are drawn up for more amphibious invasions. Specifically, the city of Fortaleza Gaza is of interest to the red team, so they do an interesting plan. They're going to have one amphibious landing up here and then another down here. Now once again, these amphibious landings, they're costing the red team a lot of troops and a lot of manpower and a ton of resources, so they aren't too practical, but at this point in the war, that's really all they can do. So they will encircle this city up here and eventually they will be able to take it. Their forces will push over here to the west up against this river here and secure a larger area, while also pushing slightly inland in order to stop any Brazilian advances and taking back this city. Now the red team has control over all of Brazil's northern ports, which are pretty important for their trade with Europe, for example, or their trade with like the Mediterranean countries. And keeping that in mind, Brazil at this point would have to trade with other countries going around Africa because access to the northern Atlantic has been cut off by the Americans and the British. Now back over in Colombia, the blue team has broken through the front line after Colombian troops got a little bit too relaxed, and they will make a push up against this river here, taking this entire area and also starting to follow said river towards the capital city of Colombia. And losing Bogota would not be a good thing for the red team. That would mean the Colombian government has to move, and every time your government has to move, bad things happen. So definitely don't want to lose the capital city of Colombia. So America will reallocate some forces into protecting their ally down here, which allows for a Brazilian counteroffensive in the Amazon region, recapturing the entrance into the Atlantic Ocean over here and taking over a lot of land. This is a big blunder by the red team, but they are able to hold out specifically over here where they had captured this major city. This is what the front lines look like as of now, but Brazil should probably be a little bit more focused over here because a ton of troops are being imported into this area. They will now begin to move down into this region of Brazil, specifically targeting this major city down here, Recife, I believe. But that city is eventually captured, and as the Americans and friends move further and further south, it becomes harder and harder to invade into areas of Brazil. They are now starting to reach the more populated areas of this country, specifically over in this region. Now taking this area at first, that was extremely challenging. Ton of people living in this area in this major city, so the forces of the red team are pretty exhausted at this point. There's less people living here than there are living down here, so maybe going through here is going to be less difficult, but the main focus of course is capturing Brasilia and also protecting Colombia, who at this point has stopped the invading forces. Now though, up in this region there will be a push to connect up these two areas of troops, so they will send troops in from the west and they'll also send troops in from the east to capture this entrance area, in which they do. And now we have one big solidified front line off the coast of Brazil. Over here, the Brazilians are still slightly pushing back against the Americans as they reach over to the border of French Guiana. They also push back a little bit more towards this city over here, but the area that they're really struggling is this inner area here where a vast majority of the red team's forces are. They'll set up a pretty good boundary between these two rivers before starting to follow this river down south towards Brasilia. Now this is just one of the spearheads that the red team is planning on developing, but a huge offensive is being planned to capture this entire inner area. And when the time comes, a very good logistical playout occurs, as red team troops pretty much just storm through the area with very much resistance, but they're kind of overpowering the resistance at this point. And encircling this major city over here, some Brazilian forces are trapped in the area and plan on holding out while they request reinforcements from the main Brazilian armies over in Brasilia. Unfortunately though, those main Brazilian armies were focused on taking back this land over here, which they are able to do, kind of defeating the spearhead a little bit. They're able to follow the river up and push back red team forces, but now the bulk of them are over here and Brazil is unable to push in and save these people. For now, the red team will continue their advance down south, once again following the coastal areas of Brazil until they eventually meet this river, and that's where they'll stop because they don't have to go south anymore. Their target is over here to the west. Back over in Colombia, we see the blue team is still having a lot of success as they now reach over into a new area, filling in all of this as occupied zone and being right on the outskirts of Bogota. Another little spearhead is made up towards this river as they fill in more and more of this area, and eventually Colombian forces are kind of squeezed out until they are pretty much at the outskirts of the capital city. Going back down south though, the American forces will continue to invade into Brazilian land, and at this point Brazil is kind of not collapsing, but their military is definitely becoming more and more unorganized, as it kind of seems like it's inevitable that America will kind of reach their goal and definitely capture Brasilia. In other words, their morale is pretty much sunk into the ocean. A few counteroffensives will take place in the south, trying to go up to free this city that has been encircled, and we even see one over here as well. But it doesn't really change the fact that a spearhead is now forming straight over towards Brasilia, and eventually they will reach the outskirts of the capital city. Now Brasilia is the actual capital of Brazil, but a lot of people think that it's Rio de Janeiro. It is a very large city, and I think it's the largest city in Brazil, but it's not their federal capital. That's actually over here in Brasilia. Now back this way, we see the counteroffensive is eventually eventually failed and the red team pushes back up against this river. And the same happens up here as they secure this entire area. Now, as for this city over here, they will fight with all of their might, but they will eventually fall. And another major city becomes captive of the American forces, who are at this point now spreading into the more central areas of Brazil, as most of the resistance is now located in the southern region. That isn't to say that this entire area is up for grab, because it isn't, but it is a lot easier to move around and to move from riverbank to riverbank, setting up these new front lines, and ultimately pressuring the Brazilian army to move south. To make things even worse for the blue team, over in Colombia, we see that an influx of American and British troops have gone ahead and made it a lot easier for this counteroffensive to take place, which has at this point taken place. They now move the blue team back another river, which gives a lot of relief over here to Bogota. The red team will also go ahead and recapture the entrance into the Amazon rainforest to officially cut off this major region over here from any kind of trade or anything like that. Essentially, they're kind of cut off, especially considering that the connection between, this area and over here, like the more federal area, is becoming more and more strained as red team troops move across Brazil. Now, you probably have noticed at this point that there's been no progress over here near Brasilia, and that's because a large portion of Brazilian and Argentinian troops are holding off the red team forces. Simply enough, the red team is a little bit too far away to continue on, and they're going to need backup, reinforcements, and a lot more resources, including oil. So the US will declare war on Iraq. No, not actually. That would start a whole other war. We don't need that to happen. But they could definitely declare war on Venezuela. They got some nice oil there. Then again, though, that would pretty much screw over Colombia, so that's definitely not going to happen. The US will start to rapidly drill in Alaska and other areas that are oil rich. Same thing with Canada. And this makes a lot of people in these two countries very unhappy. I mean, in the first place, they're probably not too happy to be in this war. And it could definitely lead to some other internal issues. But then we also have to remember that the US is currently occupying Mexico. So they have all of their oil reserves under their control. And since Mexico is one of the largest exporters of oil in the world, that's pretty convenient for the Americans. So they're going to start using some Mexican oil as well as their own from Alaska, which will pretty much refuel their war effort after it had previously frozen, and troops will eventually move in and capture the capital city of Brasilia. So Brazil will immediately move their government down to Rio de Janeiro, but this central area begins to collapse as forces fall back. With Brazil and Argentina now solely focusing on protecting the southern region, the front line over in Colombia will pretty much collapse, as any forces that are not Peruvian will leave the country. That includes Brazilian forces, and Peru versus Colombia. Colombia is going to have a really big advantage against that, especially considering they're getting help from their allies, whereas Peru is no longer getting help. So Colombian, American, and British forces will go ahead and push the Peruvians all the way out of their country, but they won't invade into Peru because that's not a priority at this point. More so, Colombia is just going to be helping out elsewhere, and more specifically against Brazil, who is the main enemy in this war. So they will send some troops into this rainforesty area. I don't know what the point of doing so would be, but maybe they're going to try to capture this major city over here. Once again, they're not going to invade into Peru because there's no point in doing so. Now back over here to this front line, things are getting harder and harder once again for the Americans as they move into the more populated area. It is important to note though that at this point Brazil has lost a ton of population and a ton of their economic resources, and it's unlikely that we'd see Brazil fight anymore. In fact, Brazil would probably surrender at this very point in time, but their last bastion of hope lies over here in Rio de Janeiro. And to put it short, it's a very, very short-lived bastion of hope, as the red team will capture the city. A lot harder to capture than the city of Brasilia or the one over here, but they are able to do it eventually. From here, they'll move out and capture yet another major city, and at this point, Brazil is probably going to surrender. Yes, they do still have some major areas, like these remaining major cities down here, but America has pretty much won the war. They have their capital city, and they have a ton of other populated areas, and they aren't going to necessarily stop until Brazil surrenders. And Brazil should probably hurry up and do that, because they're losing more and more land and more room in the peace treaty. Eventually, both Uruguay and Peru will leave the war and sign an armistice with the United States, and there are a lot of calls from within Argentina to also do the same. The capturing of this major city over here will make that official, and Argentina too will sign an armistice with the red team, leaving only Brazil left on the blue team, and with not much else to fight for, Brazil will eventually surrender. So America and their allies of Canada, the UK, France, and Colombia have won the war against Brazil. Now Brazil is still one of the stronger countries in the world. They have a very large population, the largest in South America, of course. They're also one of the largest countries in the world with a lot of different geographical challenges from within. So to go ahead and say that the US would be able to successfully do it just as I've depicted here might be a little bit far-fetched. But once again, this is a hypothetical war scenario. We don't necessarily have a time frame to work with. This war would definitely take a few years. And that's once again due to the fact that Brazil is such a large country and has so much population in it. And not only that, but it would definitely drain the red team and even the blue team countries of a lot of their resources. This would be a very costly war to go ahead and commence, and the manpower losses probably would not justify the cause, so it would be an extremely unpopular war. But it's a war that the US would most likely win as depicted in this scenario. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the peace treaty between the United States and Brazil. And this peace treaty is a pretty simple one. So to start up here in North America, we have the United States taking over a ton of provinces from Mexico. So those provinces include all of these ones. If I can click the button, there we go. All of Baja California and around 6 other provinces, or I think these are states actually, so 6 other states, and also 2 over here in the Yucatan Peninsula. So the US has basically taken over all of their interested areas in Mexico. So obviously the northern area is of interest to them because it's closest to their border, but also Baja California, that's pretty strategical, especially in the Pacific. And then the Yucatan Peninsula gives you some actual land down here to dictate better in Central America and the Caribbean. Cuba is probably, bricks coming out right now. But now moving down here to South America, this is where we see a bulk of the changes. So starting off, we see Colombia get a ton of land from Brazil. This is what was probably promised behind closed doors, as well as some other economic incentives. But they don't really get a province because this is just one big area of Brazil. More so, what they have happen here is they follow the natural boundaries of the area. So they follow this river here, and then they have kind of a connecting line between these 2 rivers and follow it up over here to Venezuela. Next up, we come over here to French Guiana, which as you can see has doubled in size. So France now just lays claim to all of the land that is to the north / to the east of this river. And then as for like this right here, I don't think this would actually happen. If anything, Brazil just gets a new government. But for the sake of the scenario, America gets a nice little colony down here on the tip of Brazil. I don't think that they would even do that. In fact, America probably wouldn't take any land in this peace treaty other than like Baja California and maybe some of the ports in Yucatan. If we're talking like totally realistic, of course, these are 2 democratic countries. They're not going to take land from each other, but it's a lot more interesting if they were to, right? Anyway, that's actually all of the land changes other than the Falklands, which goes back to the UK. Officially, there's no longer a dispute. These are British islands, and the Argentinians are very angry about this, but that's what happens when you lose the war. Uruguay and Peru didn't really receive any punishments other than some economical sanctions things that will go ahead and pay reparations over to the Americans to help them rebuild. And then Argentina, they're also going to get the economical punishments, but they also had to give up the Falklands. And then Brazil, they get a new government that is pro-American, so this is now one large American ally down here in South America. The whole point of this war was just America establishing their dominance over the Americas completely. There's no longer any other regional rival to America. The Americas are under the American sphere of influence and the American sphere of influence only. Not only that, but some of America's buddies now have some influential land over here, like French Guiana being larger and the UK officially having the Falklands. So that of course will be used to pressure these governments into doing things, changing, signing treaties, so on and so forth. Brazil losing this war would be pretty bad for the rest of these countries down here, which is why we saw countries like Peru and Uruguay and Argentina join. They didn't want this to happen. However, Brazil lost, so it did happen, unfortunately. Anyway, though, that is going to do it for today's scenario where the United States and Brazil go to war. If you guys did enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. All the support is super greatly appreciated as we're trying to get to 250,000 subscribers. That is our next major milestone, and we'll be hitting it maybe next year or the year after. I don't know. You never know. Things could change. Make sure to check out the Discord server linked in the description below. Make sure to also check out the channel memberships to get early access to each and every single one of our videos. Thank you guys so much for 200,000 subscribers, and thank you for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. And of course, thank you to all our super fans. This includes Andrew O2, Turno Apex, Omega the YouTuber, Serminator, Aiden Shen, Icy Static FN, See What I Do, CTG on YT, AdizzPro, Euroball, Bren, Jazzy Gerboa, Green France Mapping, Nevada Garbage Trucks, Vista, Nightenhood 7353, GNR95, OzGeo, Big, A Norwegian, RS, and Golden Ball Mapping, Zayland, Laser Taze, Augusto, Pablo Sigma Cat, and Hammer Toad 45. Once again, thank you guys.